This is the second of two lectures on foraging in birds. And some of this is going to be a bit of repetition of some topics that we covered earlier. But it's really going to focus on some of the behavioral adaptations birds have for foraging. So this is a black skimmer flying across the water, and you can see these on the Gulf Coast fairly commonly. And if you look at one up close, you'll notice that it has some adaptations for its skimming behavior. If you look at the upper mandible, it's considerably shorter than the lower mandible. And what it does is it drags that lower mandible through the water, and it has this behavior where if it hits a fish, with that lower mandible, it quickly dips its head to retrieve it. And that's why they're called skimmers. Other aquatic specialists have to dive for their food, and that provides a specific challenge, and that is trying to figure out exactly where that fish is because of the different density of air and water and how light beams bend differently in those different densities. If you look at a fish and you think, oh, it's right there and where you're seeing it, no, it's really it's in a different location. And birds have figured out how to make that calculation and actually aim in the correct place where the fish is and not where it appears to be from the surface. We've talked a little bit about herons and egrets and some of their behaviors as far as sit and wait predators and stirring the water with their feet in the case of the snowy egret and trying to get a little bit of contrast so that they can see their prey. Stalking prey in some cases, sit and wait predators in others. We talked about the shading behavior as seen here in this little blue heron. Some of the cooler things that birds do is actually use lures. And that includes the aquatic environment with something like this green heron shown on the left. And they use a variety of lures. This one appears to be using some kind of insect larva, but they've been known to use pieces of plastic, brightly colored pieces of plastic that float on the surface. In other cases, they'll use feathers, brightly colored leaves, and they're doing exactly what a lure should do. It brings the fish closer so that they can then attack it. And just like any good fisher person, they're going to find out what lures work and what lures don't, and they'll change out lures. They will actually carry their favorite lures with them from place to place if one side isn't working. And this isn't something that's been seen in just one population of green herons. Green herons are a cosmopolitan species, and this behavior has been reported throughout the world. Now, burrowing owls do something different. Yes, they're putting out lures, but what their lures are feces. And what they're trying to do is attract dung beetles. And then so they then eat those dung beetles. So this, in some regards, is more like ranching or farming and growing your food. Talked previously a little bit about tool use in birds, and it can be as simple as the tool use of using spines or branches in a woodpecker finch in the Galapagos Islands, or actually making and modifying structures to produce more efficient tools, as seen in the New Caledonian crows down here on the bottom. We also mentioned previously caching and the importance of the hippocampus and being able to remember where caches are stored. In some cases, that's not a big issue. Caches can be very short term, so a shrike may only leave its food cached for a short period of time in a matter of just hours, and so it doesn't have to worry about finding where that food is. Other species do long-term caching, and make the modification in your notes because I had a short-term caching with this example too. But a lot of high elevation birds that are in wintering situations where there's snow cover, they store food in these lean periods of time, but they have to, again, remember where they've stored these caches of food. And in the case of something like a Clark's nutcracker, this can include a variety of seed and nuts. We're going to talk a lot more later about parental care, but one of the important things that parents have to do is teach their young how to forage in certain cases. Now we'll see that there are some instinctual feeding behaviors, but in the case of many raptors, the parents will bring live prey to the nest, and this is a part of the process of teaching the young how to handle the prey and make the final kill before consumption. One of the species that I've studied, one of the groups I've studied are bee eaters, and I've studied several species of bee eaters. And as the name implies, one of the things that is a large part of their diet in some populations are bees. And they have to learn how to handle these bees. I've done some studies of some birds in Africa and Kenya, and there were juveniles that were just trying to learn this behavior, and you could tell that some of them were getting stung because they were not very efficient at handling the prey, took them longer to handle the bees, and sometimes they would kind of shake their head when they were clearly in pain from getting stung. It is actually interesting. They've done studies to indicate that the venom, they do have some resistance to the venom when they are stung. It takes a lot more venom in these to kill a bee eater compared to a bird of comparable size that doesn't normally deal with this prey. But the behavior that they use to subdue the prey and make it where they're less likely to get stung is called bee rubbing, but it's more really kind of like bee whacking behavior. And it happens incredibly quickly when they learn to be proficient at it. So they'll grab the bee kind of at the thorax, and then they'll alternate whacking it on its head and then rubbing the abdomen where the stinger is against a branch to try to dislodge the stinger. And then they'll also, as what's being shown here, kind of squeeze the abdomen to squeeze out any venom before consumption. And usually it just takes a couple of whacks and rubs so they can do this, and then they swallow the bee without being stung. Other birds have to deal with some really dangerous prey, and many of them have innate protective responses to, so that in a situation like this, it's not something that can be learned. It's so dangerous that in the learning process you'd probably be killed. And so this is an important instinctual behavior that has evolved in some of these lineages, like turquoise-browed motmots being shown here, and this behavior has also been shown to be instinctual in great kiskadees. There was a really cool study, a series of studies actually, in which they presented naive juvenile birds to sticks with different color patterns. Some of the color patterns are very close to some of the dangerous predators that they would have to look out for, something like a coral snake. And some looked completely different as far as coloration pattern, but had the same banding pattern, and that's what's shown here kind of in the brown and green. In other cases, they did different combinations of, instead of putting bands, they put stripes on the sticks, or putting stripes or bands on different parts of the stick and leaving the rest of the stick unbanded, to see how these naive birds would respond to this. And what they found, and was really curious, is the wooden models, the sticks that looked the most like a coral snake, the birds wouldn't approach at all. As a matter of fact, some of the research indicated that the birds would cower in the corner away from them. So they clearly had a fear for this. If, however, you just looked at a banding pattern, like the green and brown here, they were very curious about it, and they would peck it, investigating it as a potential food item. So that received almost as many pecks as the far one on the right here. This is interesting because it's got the coloration, it's got the red and the yellow, which you would think that the birds would really be avoiding that, but it's clearly not showing any of the correct banding pattern, and so they were just as likely to investigate that as they were the brown and green striped pattern. Then dropping down from that, they would peck a stick that was partially banded with what was typically very terrifying to them, but only they would peck at the end that wasn't that pattern, which was interesting. So clearly indicating that it was both a pattern and a color combination that was important to elicit this instinctual behavior. Now, in other cases, learning noxious prey really is a learned behavior, and that's what's seen in blue jays and other birds that have the potential to go after monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies show aposematic coloration, so they're brightly colored oranges and yellows with contrasting blacks. But as juveniles, they forage on milkweed plants, and they sequester the toxins associated with that milkweed, and it makes them non-palatable. It actually makes anything that eats them sick, as shown here with this naive blue jay in a training exercise. So what happens in this situation is monarchs tend to travel in fairly large concentrations, or they exist in large concentrations, so that some of the individuals of a population will die in the process of training the local predator population. But once the predators learn that something that looks like that makes you have that response, then the rest of the individuals in the population are benefiting from that behavior. So this type of aposematic coloration really wouldn't work well in a species that didn't have such dense populations, because the mere process of training the predator population would take too many of the individuals of that species out. So we talked a little bit about shrikes impaling prey on barbs and fence posts, fence wires, or in this case like a mesquite branch. And that's a form of short-term caching, but there's another thing that they could be doing in these situations, especially when they're caching them, they're sticking them in areas that have really hot sun coming down. They're known to do this more with insects that have toxins in them, noxious grasshoppers, for example, compared to more palatable ones that they'll just consume right away. So the thought is that giving them the short caching time helps to dissipate these toxins. Now I want to kind of shift topics and concentrate on some of the benefits of birds flocking together relative to foraging. So there are a lot of benefits of flocking. One of the ones related to foraging is you can kind of concentrate your prey and be more efficient at catching more prey, or sometimes working together individuals might be able to catch prey larger than a single individual would have been able to take down and consume. This kind of catchment method is being shown here with various species of birds, pelagic birds, chasing after a school of fish, concentrating those to make it more efficient that individuals can capture them. Here's the same thing shown with some pelicans. Pelicans will act kind of almost like synchronized swimmers. They'll approach a school of fish, kind of encircle it, and then plunge their heads down and try to get a mouthful of fish at the same time once those fish have been concentrated. Harris hawks are a beautiful hawk, kind of a chocolatey brown with reddish patches in the wings that you can see in West Texas and the rest of the desert Southwest. And they live in groups. We'll talk about cooperative breeding a little bit later in the semester, but one of the other things that happens in this group living bird is they forage together. So they do these cooperative hunts. And here's a behavioral study where they did kind of a time budget on this process. You can see it at 12:27, the study began, so we're following 5 hawks. You see that they travel to this one location and they make an unsuccessful strike at the prey. But then the prey, this rabbit, is running, and you see the movement of some individuals in the group chasing after the rabbit, and then finally they converge on this rabbit and kill and then share in the feeding of it. Well, you may be thinking, why would they work together, just one rabbit for 5 individuals? Well, what this rabbit was doing in the process was diving from bush to bush and hiding. Usually, if you go to the desert Southwest, there's prickly pear cactus, and growing out of the center of it something like a mesquite tree, and the rabbit is basically hiding out in there. Well, what these birds do is 2 or 3 birds may be hanging out in the mesquite bushes surrounding that, watching, while 2 of the other individuals will approach the cactus cluster and reach their long legs in there, trying to flush or beat the rabbit out of that, so that then one of the sentinel individuals can swoop down and kill it, and then they share in that reward. Sometimes one of the biggest benefits of foraging in flocks or living in groups is finding food. And so this is where the information center hypothesis comes into play. So if you're a colonial nesting or a group roosting bird at night, you can get information on prey resources at those locations. So for example, at a colonial nesting group of birds, everybody goes out foraging in the morning looking for, say, a school of fish. Some individuals come back not finding any fish, but they notice other individuals did find fish. And if we're talking about schools of fishes, then you follow that individual back out once it's dropped off its fish at its nest. You follow it to find the school of fish, and so that kind of shared information helps everybody in the colony. Well, the next day, you might be the lucky individual that found food, and the individual the previous day that was lucky didn't have success, but now they benefit from that group situation. In something like a vulture, it would work a little differently. If you are foraging independently throughout the day, some individuals are going to find prey and other individuals aren't, but they're not going to be able to consume the whole carcass. So they're going to come back to this group roost at night, and individuals can sense which individuals fed successfully that day, and if they didn't have access to prey, they're going to follow those individuals back out to the carcass the next day. Now sometimes being in a flock works in the opposite. It actually protects you from being eaten. And this can work in several ways. One is simply what's called the dilution effect. Let's say a predator attacks your group and you're in a group of 10. Well, if that predator is going to kill one individual, you only have a 10% chance of being the individual killed. If you're in a group of just 2 and one individual is dying, then you got a 50-50 chance of being the individual killed. So the larger the group you're in, the greater the dilution of the probability of you dying. But then there's some other things that can happen in a flock that can minimize the chance that anybody's going to be killed. So the flock shape will change as a predator approaches, and that's what's being shown here with these starlings flying, being attacked by a peregrine falcon. By forming this dense aggregation, it makes it more difficult for the predator to focus on one individual if they're kind of twisting and circling in this dense cluster. And so it reduces the chance that they'll be able to successfully get any individual. I like to compare this like if I had one tennis ball and I threw it to you. You should be able to catch that, and if not, I would probably laugh at you. But let's say that I get 4 tennis balls and throw all of them at you at once. There's a much better shot, even if you're a pretty good catch, that you're not going to be able to concentrate on a single ball and you won't be able to catch any of them. That's the basic idea here. There's another benefit of being in a group, and it's kind of turning the tables and actually being aggressive against the potential threat, and that's mobbing the predator. We'll talk more about this when we talk about vocalizations later in the semester, but the idea is that you gather a group of individuals to attack the predator and to drive it out of the area so that it benefits everybody's safety. But if you are a species that has the potential to be attacked by a predator, and you need to forage, you can benefit from the things I talked about previously about minimizing your chance of predation, but by having more individuals looking for predators while you're foraging in a large group, just that in itself can benefit you. Because, for example, you have more individuals at any one time looking up in all different directions. Right? So you may be having your head down, and if everybody is kind of eating and looking up at random, then this allows the group to benefit from a faster response, the detection of the approach of a predator at a greater distance and sooner. And at the same time, you don't have to be the entire individual responsible for that sentinel behavior. So you can actually spend more time, everybody in the group can spend more time foraging and less worried about predation because of these group benefits of increased scanning as a group, greater detection, and earlier detection. But in a situation like this, is this based on trust? Do birds actually trust each other, or are they somehow kind of keeping an eye out on their neighbors to make sure that they're doing their part? Because you could see in a situation like this, where a selfish gene could evolve. So a group member says, everybody else is looking out for predators, I'm just going to eat. I'm not going to do my part. Well, if that gene spread, then the group benefit would deteriorate and it wouldn't be evolutionarily stable. So what kind of mechanism would allow individuals to kind of keep each other honest? Well, they did a study looking at starlings, and they had a situation where starlings were feeding in a field with no barrier in between them so they can kind of keep an eye on their neighbor. But then they also had them foraging in these little compartments such that if they bent down to forage, they couldn't see what individuals in the next compartment over were doing. And so they didn't get a sense of protection by checking on their neighbors. And the idea was, would this affect their behavior? And sure enough, you spend more time scanning for predators when there's a barrier. When there's no barrier, you can kind of keep your eye out on your neighbor, and you actually spend less individual time scanning. That's what's shown here on the lower left. So you're more wary when there's a barrier and you can't verify that everybody else is doing their job. Well, how does that relate to foraging efficiency? Well, it's exactly what you'd expect. When there's no barrier in a natural situation, they're actually foraging a lot more per minute. They have more foraging events per minute compared to situations when there's a barrier. So when you can't trust your individuals around you, you can't verify that they're doing their job, you're more wary, you spend less time feeding and more time scanning for predators yourself. So there are a lot of benefits of living in a flock, but there are obviously some costs associated with flocking. Sometimes that could be associated with competition for food. So anybody that's ever had a bird feeder can see that there is, despite the fact that there may be plenty of food, there can be some competition for those food resources. In some cases, you can also see what is called kleptoparasitism, where one individual gets a prey item, and then someone comes around and steals it. And that's what's being shown here with this frigate bird stealing the food that was captured by a tropic bird in white. Now, there are some ways to minimize competition. And we've seen a little bit in our labs this semester some mixed species foraging flocks. These are flocks of foraging individuals composed of multiple species. Now, in the tropics, these tend to be very large, and you see them year-round. So you may be wandering through the tropics in a forest. You won't see any birds for a long time, and then suddenly you're just covered with a whole bunch of birds. So it's more species involved, more individuals involved, and in the wintertime is where you typically see this behavior in temperate zones. So up here in Texas is when we tend to see mixed species flocks. So what's the importance of a mixed species flock, foraging flock, potential benefits compared to a single species foraging flock? Well, different species have different foraging niches. And so this is a way of niche partitioning, something that we've talked about previously during the semester. So you get all the benefits of foraging as a group, for example, finding and following prey, avoiding predation, but it reduces competition by all the individuals of the different species concentrating on a different aspect of the foraging resources. And researchers have noticed that as you follow a mixed species foraging flock, it tends to be occupied by the same species, but over a long distance, it's not the same individuals. So there are home ranges, say for example of a titmouse and a chickadee, that occupy one foraging flock, and as that foraging flock travels, it gets to the edge of their home range. Well, it generally abuts another home range of another set of individuals of their species. And so you may not notice unless you have individuals marked. You just see that there's always chickadees and titmice associated with this flock, but it's different individuals. As the flock moves along, its members change. Now, one of the things that is a benefit in a mixed species foraging flock is the ability to alert individuals of potential threats by doing a mobbing call or an alarm call. And as I mentioned to you in labs, these are calls that help to rally the troops of different species to drive off potential predator, but it immediately removes everybody's attention from foraging. This has led to the occasional use in some species of fake alarm calls. So giving an alarm call, basically crying wolf. And so if a tanager, for example, is diving after a prey and it's being, some insect, and it notices another bird is going after that, a white-winged tanager sometimes will give an alarm call to make that other bird kind of freak out and back off so that they can get that prey. Now, this wouldn't work if they do it too often, so this has to be something that is used occasionally. It has to be a situation where alarm calls or mobbing calls, typically when they're used, they're adaptive for their intended purposes. But some species do use these on occasion to benefit from deception. So this can include, again, just making false alarm calls, but in some cases, to specifically get a bigger reaction out of one species, they'll mimic the species-specific alarm call of that species. As you can see here, we've got 3 different species of model that are being mimicked by a drongo that is in competition and giving these false alarm calls. But we will see that even though there can be some species-specific mobbing vocalizations and alarm calls, there are some general signatures that have co-evolved such that there is efficient communication across species in indicating this is an alarm call or this is a mobbing call. Mobbing calls tend to be these broadband, kind of harsh vocalizations. So when you hear me pitching out in the field, that's basically what I'm doing. We'll talk more about that when we talk about vocalizations in birds. One specific type of mixed species foraging flocks are oftentimes associated with army ants. And if you go to the tropics, you see these army ant following species. Oftentimes there is a dominant nuclear species that takes up the best positions in these foraging flocks. What they're doing is they're following these army ants, and as the army ants are moving through the forest, insects are flying up to try to escape. Well, the birds take advantage of that by capturing them. But again, the bird that it takes up kind of the best space and kind of leads the direction of the mixed species flock, that's the dominant or the nuclear species. Now you see the same thing. You see dominant nuclear species in mixed species foraging flocks, not associated with army ant followers. But I'm just talking about it in the context of the army ant followers. So, for example, in a mixed species foraging flock up here in Texas, oftentimes it's chickadees and titmice that tend to direct the motion of those flocks. Here's just kind of a schematic. You can see the army ants kind of swarming an area, kicking up insects, and something like an ocellated antberg is going to be directing where these birds are locating relative to the swarm, kind of directing the motion as the ants follow, and other birds are kind of in the periphery taking advantage of this as well. Lastly, there's some evidence. I talked previously about the coevolution between honey badgers and honey guides, and humans and honey guides, to find hives of honeybees, and then the birds benefit from the larger species tearing up that so that they can get access to the waxes. There's evidence that common ravens and wolves may have some of the same co-evolved cooperative behaviors. The ravens, when they find a large carcass in the dead of winter when it's frozen and really hard, they'll call loudly, and they'll do that to attract other common ravens, but they themselves don't have the power to oftentimes get at that tissue because it's hard and frozen. So by also attracting a pack of wolves, they can tear that carcass up. They get obviously most of that, but then the ravens will get access to some of that food as well. But because the ravens can fly, they're more likely to find those carcasses before the wolves do.